Hello, this is Bange from Taylor Wessing. Welcome to our webinar today. Today's webinar is part of our regular webinar program, where we bring your expertise and views on topical data protection, GDPR, and cybersecurity issues. Our regular attendees will be very familiar with our previous topics, which have included looking at challenges such as GDPR and the numerous elements that fall under that particular beast. More specific areas like direct marketing and some of the controversial areas of enforcement like ad tech. We've also had some more internationally focused sessions bringing you much more multinational updates as well. And recordings of those webinars are available if you missed them and if you still wish to engage with us on those particular topics. In fact, there's some 30+ webinars to access in our virtual data protection learning bank. Today, we will be continuing on the theme of security with our cybersecurity update. I can see that we also have some new attendees today. So for those of you that are new to this webinar series, Taylor Wessing is a leading international law firm. We act for a range of leading clients in local and international markets, providing a full-service law firm offering. And we do so from our office footprint, which spans across Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, across Asia, and also in the United States. We've listed more details about the firm towards the end of the slide deck, so you can see that when the slides are circulated, and also towards the end of the presentation. And that's just there for your reference. Today's webinar is brought to you by Taylor Wessing's International Data and Cyber Practice. Our team advises on all aspects of data protection, GDPR, and cybersecurity. And as a dedicated practice, we are a global 26-partner-driven team, also complemented by our international network of data privacy law specialists to give you a true global one-stop shop support service. At Taylor Wessing, we also have a dedicated microsite, which is specifically for all things data protection and cybersecurity, and that's our global data hub. From this global data hub microsite, you'll be able to access weekly news that give you an update that cuts through the privacy noise and focuses on key issues. Bring you topical issues that we look at regularly, where there perhaps are concerns or issues that are raising particular challenges, and we bring you our thought leadership across those specific areas too. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also access our bank of webinars and also be aware of our events around the world forthcoming, and also our archive webinars. Of course, through the Global Data Hub, you can also see our latest products and services, whether it's a Global Data Protection Guide, or which gives you that at-a-glance view of data protection regimes around the world. And there are numerous tools there that are available for you to look at. My name, as I said, is Bange. I'm head of the data protection practice. I'm delighted today that my international colleagues are with me to bring you this cybersecurity focused update. So soon I'll hand over to Paul Glass, who leads our cybersecurity practice, and he's based in London. We're also delighted to have Voigt, who is our cybersecurity law expert based in Berlin, and he'll be talking about some of the German-specific issues that we're seeing from a cybersecurity law perspective. We're also delighted to welcome Vijay Rathour, a digital forensics expert from the fantastic team at Thornton. How do I know they're fantastic? Well, because we've collaborated with Vijay and his team on many client engagements, and also to bring you events like this webinar as well. So we are delighted that Vijay is back with us, I should say, by popular demand as much as anything else. No inference should be drawn around popularity, given the fact that actually my key role today is only to introduce the webinar. So my role today is rather limited. And you're really going to be in the hands of our team of key speakers with Paul, Howell, and with Vijay. So buckle up. I'm going to hand you over to Paul Glass, who's going to get us started. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Finn, and fantastic to have such a good turnout and to have everybody here on what is a gloriously sunny afternoon. So I was going to talk about, and obviously this webinar was partially advertised about, an update on the British Airways fine from the ICO. Many of you will have spotted that the British Airways fine is unfortunately missing in action at the moment. This was, we were hoping to see, going to be the most significant fine yet by the ICO. When the notice of intent was handed down at the end of June last year, it was just over £183 million, with the previous biggest fine under GDPR being the €50 million that the CNIL handed down against Google. So it was going to be the biggest fine by quite a big margin. Monetary penalty notices are supposed to be handed down within 6 months of the notice of intent. So from the end of June last year, we were looking at the end of December. That 6-month period can be extended by agreement. And we've had a couple of extensions, which took us to the 31st of March 2020. Then, obviously, the world changed somewhat in late February, early March, as coronavirus became a global pandemic. And this impacted the two large fines expected from the ICO, both that's British Airways and the Marriott fine of £99 million. One of the relevant factors which the ICO does take account of is the ability of the data controller to pay the fine, and they look at that when setting the quantum. And British Airways and Marriott, we understand, have both made additional submissions on this issue. Now, where does that leave us at the moment? So it was reported a little while back by British Airways itself in one of its regulatory filings and elsewhere in relation to Marriott that the British Airways fine the monetary penalty notice was due to be handed down on the 18th of May. Marriott was reported to be due on the 9th of June. Now, as some of you may have noticed, it's now the 20th of May, and we have nothing in relation to British Airways. It was reported last week by MLEX that the commissioner had made comments at a conference in Washington, D.C. I don't know whether she was actually attending or was there virtually, that the British Airways fine had been delayed until August. This hasn't been picked up more widely. So we don't know what the position is at the moment. It doesn't appear to have been confirmed that that is the case. And we don't have a press release from the ICO confirming that that is the position. So we're somewhat in limbo at the moment. Where this does leave us is that we currently still only have one data breach fine, I should say, by the ICO under GDPR. And what would have been prospectively the two biggest fines in Europe are missing in action at the moment, probably expected in August, but it's not very clear. So I'm afraid for both of those, it's hunker down and wait and see what happens with little information in the meantime. Many of you will also have seen, while we're on the subject of airlines, that it was reported yesterday that EasyJet have had a data breach. And there are a few queries going around about what that's likely to mean in terms of fine. The reality is it's far too early to tell at the moment. We know that there's believed to be around 9 million records of personal data which have been compromised, and 2,208 credit cards, including CVVs. We don't know anything at the moment really about who the threat actor is, what vulnerabilities were exploited. So it's really too early to tell. So if you're getting questions about that, I'm afraid the answer at the moment is we don't know what any likely investigation or fine in relation to EasyJet is going to be. So unfortunately, my main part is wait and see, missing in action at the moment. The other issues I was going to talk very briefly about are some things that we're seeing coming up in queries for cybersecurity in the time of COVID. And I'll also chat a bit about what the ICO is doing in terms of regulation and enforcement. So what's changed? For many businesses, we've had a sudden shift to what is a very highly distributed IT network with endpoints of questionable security. The reality is whereas a lot of businesses had some staff working from home, we now typically in a lot of businesses, particularly based in London, have the entire workforce or a very substantial proportion of the workforce working from home. And there is a challenge in protecting the business while ensuring that those operations that the business operations continue without interruption. There is a bit of a risk of the business saying, what risk is the business taking on as a result of the shift? And the focus can be on, great, we're all working remotely, job done, rather than assessing what that actually means in terms of risk. So And the issues are clearly different from each business. Some businesses are going to be scaling existing solutions, others putting in place entirely new systems to enable the workforce to work remotely at scale. That's the sort of technical side of things. What's often missed in the sort of sudden shift and flurry to moving to working remotely is actually looking at what are the internal policies and processes that are in place. Are they adequate for a new world where virtually the entire workforce is working remotely? Do they need amending? And this will cover things like, well, is there actually a working remotely policy? What do the acceptable use policies say? And are they sufficient to cover the risks that the entire workforce suddenly moving to a remote environment creates? If you need to change the policies to take account of new risks, employee education is key, actually pushing out those new policies, making sure that employees understand what's changed, why it's changed, is crucial. And that cannot necessarily be as easy as it otherwise would be if everybody was in the office. The reality is that COVID has changed the risk landscape. Attackers are seeking to take advantage of that situation. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I know Vijay is going to pick up some of those issues at the end as well. One other point to think about here is also insurance from the business perspective. Is the insurance position still adequate? Are there exclusions or carve-outs which you could have lived with before in your broader business risk policies or specific cyber liability policies, which are now much more of a concern in the current environment? So it is worth revisiting those policies and actually thinking, do we have the coverage that we thought we had in the environment where large proportions of the workforce are working from home on a very regular basis? Just pulling out some issues around around risk. And the next two slides are internal and external risk. But I've actually deliberately sort of blurred the lines slightly on these. So some of the issues which are described as are on the internal slide could be viewed as external, and vice versa. Part of the reason for that is that a lot of businesses rely on physical security of office premises as part of their overall security risk profile. That's changed in the current environment because that barrier, that physical firewall, is no longer in place with staff working from home to the extent that they now are. So I've deliberately muddled these up a bit just to make people think a bit around, well, some of these are internal and external risks. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to zip through these relatively quickly, not necessarily talk about all of them, but hopefully having points on the slides will provide some issues to think about. And if you've got any queries to follow up with, then please do let us know afterwards. So I talked a bit before about scaling remote access VPN systems. Obviously, larger businesses should have those in place anyway to allow employees to work from home. But we've seen issues with clients where multi-factor authentication systems don't scale to the extent necessary, and that makes it more difficult for staff to actually work from home in a productive way, which then creates its own issues. Other businesses that run on BYOD, use your own laptop, perhaps not with the appropriate security in place. Those staff are now working much more regularly on a network which may have unsecured endpoints, maybe insecure connection issues. There may be threats from the home network. We all have now huge numbers of Wi-Fi enabled devices at home, particularly where people do work in a more connected home environment. How secure are those devices? How secure is the home network, and what threat does that pose, both for a remote access VPN connected home computer and where those arrangements aren't in place? Should businesses be looking at audits of home network security for senior staff? I know some professional services firms do look at this and do actually either have a sort of audits checklist or even send members of IT teams out to secure home networks for senior staff only. I referred a bit to are the current policies adequate? Do they need revising? Just picking up on that a little bit. Some of the difficulties from working from home or working remotely at scale. Staff will often ignore policies in the name of getting things done. because of difficulties created by working remotely. So staff, if they're having trouble accessing documents or saving documents where they're supposed to be on the system, or they're having trouble printing documents, staff will try and come up with workarounds. They'll try and upload things to some cloud service, OneDrive or etc., and then give themselves a personal cloud service and then access that from their home laptop and print it from there, for example. Understanding that kind of shadow IT risk and how that changes in the current environment is key. And the last point there, can third-party providers, including securities, if you've got an outsourced SOC or outsourced SIEM or something like that, can they adequately support you in the new world where you've got significant numbers of staff working from home? A couple of points on external risk. As some of you may have seen, there are a sort of series of massive COVID-related phishing campaigns at the moment. I think the numbers we've seen are the biggest single-issue phishing campaigns. So this is anything from emails pretending to be from the WHO if it's external, or from your HR team if it's internal, saying, "Hi, the attached Word document has the latest guidance on testing or whatever to do with COVID." Or it'll be phishing links encouraging people to click here to access a whole suite of possible services with COVID in play. And there is a lot more of that going on at the moment, and they are increasing in effectiveness because staff don't necessarily have the mentality that they would have in the office of being aware of those kind of links. So thinking about additional staff training here is important. I've picked up a few other issues there, which sort of are self-explanatory. The only one I wanted to pick up specifically is, it's quite interesting, if you do some searches on Shodan, which is the sort of, search engine identifying unsecured endpoints and servers, 41% increase in endpoints visible to Shodan, which are potentially unsecured in April. That is partially going to be linked to the fact that an awful lot of people are suddenly working from home when they weren't before. Interception or whaling fraud is increasing as businesses have to adapt payment controls and processes. So this is where people pretend to be the CEO asking for payments to this account, or intercept payments from a business to a supplier and say, pay this bank account in Hungary rather than our usual Barclays Bank in London, and people still fall for that. The issue here is that businesses are having to put in place new payment control systems and adapt to those, and attackers are taking advantage of that. So that's just sort of a quick run through some of the issues that we're seeing around that. I wanted to highlight the ICO's approach in the current time, because as many of you will have seen, the ICO has put out some specific commentary and guidance on the website as to how they are enforcing data protection law during COVID. The overall message is that data protection law is obviously still here. It still needs to be complied with. But the guidance is very clear that the ICO will regulate in a pragmatic and proportionate way and will reassess their priorities in the current environment. The ICO does recognize there are additional pressures on businesses in the sort of change in working patterns and what that might mean from a security point of view. They have said that they are focusing efforts on the most serious challenges and the greatest threats to the public. What that means in practice is still to be seen, and I'll come on quickly to a couple of points on that in a minute. If you do have a data breach, the 72-hour notification that's notifiable, the 72-hour notification window still applies. That is, the ICO has expressly stated that. But there is an acknowledgement that that might not always be possible. For example, your security teams are now spread around working from home, and while obviously an awful lot can be done remotely, it depends on what your IT infrastructure and architecture looks like. So the ICO does acknowledge that, and there's an express statement that they will seek to understand the individual challenges faced by organizations. That doesn't, and will take into account whether the organization's difficulties result from COVID issues. Now, this isn't it's not carte blanche to say, oh, COVID meant that we couldn't investigate a breach properly, or that we didn't patch and that resulted in this breach. It is very much case by case. And the ICO has made it clear that they will want to understand specifically what the issue was and why that meant that a breach happened, which might not otherwise have happened, or why notification didn't happen within 72 hours when it should have done. So it is still a grey area as to how this will be applied in practice, but the ICO is pragmatic about it. There is express recognition for the potential for reduced fines in the current crisis. There have been reported comments by the Commissioner in relation to British Airways and Marriott, because obviously they are in industries that's very heavily impacted, that we may see reduced fines. Still wait and see what actually happens on that. Some of you, very quickly, before I hand over to Powell, may have seen an article in Vice magazine yesterday, which said that basically the ICO has downed tools on enforcement during coronavirus and investigations. I don't think that is correct. We still have a number of investigations ongoing where we are actually, with clients, supporting the ICO in criminal prosecutions of third parties or ex-employees. And we have had direct engagement, communication with the ICO, preparation of witness statements, etc. So there is still clearly a reasonable amount of work going on, but the ICO is, I think, stretched and is very much focusing its resources where it considers it key to do so in the current environment. On that note, if there are any questions, please do let us know at the end, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Paul Voigt, who's going to speak to some of the issues that he's been seeing in Germany recently.
Thanks very much, Paul. Cybercrime is, as Paul just mentioned, on the rise, not only during Corona times, but also before that. According to our German Federal Cybersecurity Agency, the most common IT security threats that we see are identity theft and malware, and apparently there are roughly 300,000 new malware applications coming up each day. Yeah? Still, these threats are quickly followed in the ranking by ransomware attacks, and we have seen quite a few of them over the last year or so. In ransomware attacks, the hackers try to force the victims into paying a certain amount of money, and generally the ransomware either encrypts the data that you hold in your system and only allows you to access your data once you have paid a certain sum, or the victim is threatened with leaking the data that has been found on the victim systems. And we have seen quite a few attacks on individuals lately. These attacks on individuals still are often some random attacks, sending out spam emails and just randomly hope someone will click on it and install the malware contained in the emails. But in the business sector, so where enterprises are attacked, the threats we are seeing are often much, much more advanced. So last year, for example, we have dealt with an attack for a client. It was quite a big attack on a multinational corporation, and the attack led to the systems of the client being down for about a month, and did not only affect the back office systems such as accounting and HR, but also actually the production side of their systems. And for about a month, they have not been able to produce the products they are generally building, and obviously leading to delays in their deliveries and PR issues. It was very difficult in this specific case to decrypt the data on the system, and whenever they turned on their system and they thought they had found the solution and have remedied it, the ransomware continued to decrypt the data on their systems. What we had seen in this case, but also in other cases, was that the attackers had been quite advanced and did not just randomly send out malware, but they had actually started with more sophisticated tools, spying at the client for about a year, collecting information, finding about the most neurologic and relevant points and issues, and attacked these specific weak points or neurologic points with a decryption ransomware. So it was not by accident that the production size of the client had been down for such a long time, but this was actually deliberately planned by the attacker, and thus increasing the ransom that should have been paid by the client. So what do you do when you actually experience such a ransomware attack? I mean, quite obviously, the first thing that should be done when you find out that you have been hit by ransomware is that you need to bring in some kind of IT assistance. This can be your internal IT department, but very often it's helpful to bring in external IT forensic companies to help you deal with the matter and remedy the issues. In some legal markets, and Paul can speak on that, for example, this should be the case in UK, but also the US, it is often recommendable not just to hire that IT forensic yourself, but actually engage it as a subcontractor of your external legal counsel. this way, you can take advantage of the legal privilege that your legal counsel has, also with respect to the findings of the IT forensic firm. And this can potentially shield you at a later stage, for example, with respect to investigations by regulators or with respect to discovery requests in class actions in the US, for example. From a German perspective, under German law, we don't have such a legal privilege. So theoretically, it would also be possible to hire the IT forensic firm directly. Still, even though we don't know this legal privilege as our UK and US colleagues do, it may still make sense, at least to think about hiring the forensic firm via external legal counsel, as while this does not have any impact in the German legal market, it could potentially have an impact on legal claims in other legal markets. If you have someone, internal or external IT assistants, they will usually start right away, and I think Vijay can speak much better on that. Start with fact finding. Yeah, when has the attack taken place? Which hardware and software has been affected? And they will document the findings. And based on these findings, you can start assessing the risks and potential remediation measures, both on an IT perspective, but also obviously on a legal and even to some extent on a PR perspective. So you have to find out, is it possible to decrypt some of the data that has already been encrypted? Do you have a backup system so you can easily restore the data that has been encrypted or decrypted? This sounds like a very easy task, but what we see actually quite often is, or at least from time to time, that a backup is not as good as it was supposed to be. Maybe important information is missing, or sometimes even the valid data that is included in the backup is overwritten by new decrypted data. So basically, at least parts of the backup may become useless. From a legal perspective, obviously, and Paul already mentioned it, very often you will have to think about notifying regulators quite quickly about the breach. For example, if personal data, so any information relating to individuals, for example, your staff or also contact persons at clients or targets, has been leaked or decrypted, you will generally have to notify the privacy regulators within a period of 72 hours after finding out about the breach. And this 72-hour period is extremely short, in particular if you need to take care at the same time of remedying the attack and ensuring a recovery not only of the data that has been encrypted, but also of your business activities that may be down at the same time. So it's generally helpful to be prepared in that regard, having certain procedures in place, guidelines, escalation procedures to be able to quickly react to the respective breach. Still, these notification obligations don't only exist in the privacy field, but depending on the scope of the breach and also on the industry that you're in, other regulators may need to be approached. So, for example, in Germany, we have the Federal Security Agency, BSI, that needs to be notified if you are a provider of essential services, for example, because you're in the energy, water, or telecommunication sector, and your IT systems have been attacked, you may need to notify the BSI, the German Federal IT Security Agency, of the respective attack, even if no personal data has been involved at all and just relates to IT systems. These respective notification obligations and also even actually the requirement to have adequate technical systems in place, even if personal data is not involved, will be hardened in Germany to quite some extent, because we're currently about to introduce a new IT security law. It's called IT Security Law 2.0, which would significantly increase the burden on companies in that regard. So on the one hand, the burden is increased because the scope of the new law would be much wider than it currently is. So far, only providers of essential services, as the ones mentioned before, would be regulated. But in future, also other companies whose services are of general interest to the society will be regulated, What exactly this means is certainly unclear and will need to be defined, but it is already clear that the scope will be broadened, and the scope will also be broadened with respect to providers of hardware and software that is used by the providers of essential services. So also subcontractors can, at least to some extent, be regulated by the new law, and which is probably the most important point so far, non-compliance with current IT security requirements, so IT Security Law 1.0, if no personal data is involved, can be fined only with up to 100,000 euros, and these fines shall be increased significantly to a GDPR level, basically up to 20 million euros, or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher for respective non-compliance with the IT security requirements, regardless of whether personal data is involved. In addition to the privacy regulators and the cybersecurity regulators, it may be wise to contact the Federal Police Authority and this respective cybersecurity unit to discuss the attack and to see whether there is any way they can assist you with reaching out to the attacker or even prosecuting them, although these efforts are likely in vain. It may still be helpful to speak with them and take advantage of their experience. Also, to the extent that personal data was breached, in addition to the notification obligation to the regulators, you may be obliged to reach out to the individuals whose data was leaked or decrypted, informing them about the breach and the potential consequences for those individuals. Very often, these breaches don't only have a national impact. So you do not, for example, if your breach has taken place in a German subsidiary, it will not only be German law that you have to take into account, but often you will feel the respective attacks on a worldwide level. And so you should also take a look at requirements in other countries. For example, when it comes to cyber breaches, there are notification requirements in quite a number of countries worldwide, even outside of the European Union. And when you make these respective notifications, this has to be taken into account, and you'll have to make respective notifications, which can be privacy related, but which can also only be IT security related in other countries. Still, you should not only consider making these notifications, but you should also carefully consider what information do you share with the public and the respective regulators, because at least to some extent, too broad notification or too broad transparency could fall back on you. Let's take a look at the US, for example. If public statements have been made or too much information has been shared with the regulator, potentially, this is at least what our US colleagues tell me, this information can be used in class actions, and there is no way to get statements back that are already out. So you should be careful in assessing what information do you actually share, what information are you actually obliged to share with the regulators and the individuals. Still, from a legal perspective, notification requirements are not the only issue that you have to worry about. You should think about, regardless of these notification requirements, about general communication of the breach to contract partners and clients. For example, if you worry that email accounts may have been hijacked, you should think about informing banks that they should not make payments based on requests that are sent from your systems. Likewise, you could reach out to clients who might be asked to redirect payments to accounts of the attacker. With respect to clients, obviously, it may also make sense to communicate and discuss with them that the breach may potentially have an impact on your services and a respective delay in your services in order to avoid any repercussions or damage claims, etc. in that regard. You should also, at the beginning, quite early, try to check whether there may be insurance cover with respect to the breach, regardless of whether you have a cybersecurity insurance or whether your normal liability insurance might cover the breach, although the latter will likely be possible only under very limited circumstances. Still, checking with your insurance quite early on during the breach might ensure better coverage of the incident. Also, there are actually quite a few legal issues that are not obvious at first sight, not as obvious, for example, as the notification obligation, which basically everyone knows about. For example, Very often contracts and business communication as well as invoices are only stored in an electronic way. If you're not able to produce these documents and you can't show them to the tax authority in order to calculate your fiscal obligations, at least from a German perspective, German law, tax law perspective, this would allow the authorities to estimate your earnings, which is often not very beneficial to the taxpayers. The impossibility to produce respective documents might, in the worst case, even lead to fines. In the worst of all cases, if you, even with the assistance of the external forensic company, are not able to remedy the breach and decrypt the data on your systems, very often companies will think about paying the required ransom. And this is, of course, generally not recommended by the authorities, as payment will be an incentive for attackers of keeping up their attacks. But still, as a last resort, some companies will consider respective payments. And then you should think about what does that mean from a legal perspective. Is it potentially a criminal offense to make respective payments, anonymous payments, which are often made in Bitcoin, to the attackers? At least from a German criminal law perspective, very likely this would not be a criminal offense. Still, again, might make sense to liaise with the federal police in that regard to discuss how to proceed to build up a defensible position in that regard. Regardless of the legal impact of paying the ransom, respective payments will potentially be difficult from an organizational perspective, at least to some extent, because the companies that have been impacted often won't be used to paying in Bitcoin, also probably within a relatively short period of time, because once you have approached the attacker, payment will need to be done relatively quickly. So this is something which also is a hurdle to some extent for companies. In addition to the legal issues, obviously PR issues may also play a role when suffering a ransomware attack, and a professional communication should take place in that regard with respect to employees, obviously, but also with respect to customers and contract partners. Again, of course, having in mind the advantages of a transparent communication with the disadvantage of a respectively transparent communication, depending on the legal markets that may be affected here with respect to the ransomware attack. Once everything is finalized and you have been able to remedy the breach, you should think about the lessons learned from the attack. For example, if you could set up some kind of process for dealing with those kind of attacks and breaches in the future. You could think about implementing hardened IT security systems and train your employees in order to avoid respective breaches, but also to cope with respective breaches should they take place. You might also want to think about signing up to a breach insurance police, or at least consider this. What we actually see quite often is that the budget of the IT department with respect to IT security issues increases quite significantly, but only after the first big breach has happened. I will pass on to Vijay now to speak about the forensic issues in that regard.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, my colleagues at Taylor Wessing. That was a fantastic introduction. And I see that we have a very large number of colleagues joining us from many different types of businesses. And we've heard a nice introduction on effectively the growth of GDPR, the finding regime, and the regulatory and practical responses to how the world is acting and reacting to cybersecurity. And in fact, my session today is hopefully not going to overlap too much with the work of my colleagues, in the sense that I'm going to be trying to think about one specific angle of the work that I do. And just to build upon the introduction that Vin provided earlier, I'm Vijay Rathour. I'm a partner at Thornton within our forensic investigations team, which conducts many different types of investigations. But my life itself, specifically my professional life, has been that I started my career as a barrister, in fact, as a lawyer many years ago. And once upon a time, I was a practicing lawyer, a commercial litigator, and then I went over to the FCA and I became a regulator. And having worked as a regulator for some time, actually my secret love was actually as a hacker. So I'd been a hacker and a programmer and a technologist, and so having practiced in these types of areas, I found the opportunity to build my career together to become effectively a cyber consultant. And in that world of cyber consultancy, I've been helping a lot of clients with effectively how they personally deal with the cyber crisis. And so not merely the corporate response, but specifically thinking about their own personal response to a cyber crisis. And so I'm going to try to focus a little bit on in this session about, yes, we're living in exceptional times, the world is changing, but also then build up to specifically how do we as a corporate, as senior executives inside the business, how do the executives specifically and personally manage their crisis response? So hopefully I will take a slightly human approach also to a very technical area. And I do regard myself as quite a nerd. So I have every respect for the nerds. But at the same time, the world of cyber also has to be human. We are commonly dealing with the press, we're dealing with customers, we're dealing with our staff, we're dealing with our regulators, and there certainly is a human response required to the cyber world that we live in as well. So starting with perhaps the type of thing that you've seen a few times before, and you've heard from our colleagues. There is absolutely a measurable increase in cyber activity, so malicious cyber activity that's been going on since the start of the COVID crisis. And this is partly built upon the fact that we are seeing an increase in cyber attacks everywhere, but specifically as a result of COVID, we're seeing an increase in specific types of activity. So we're seeing a very significant increase in opportunistic attacks that have been taking place as a result of the way that we are starting to work in different ways. Paul touched upon the fact that we are now working in agile environments, using more Wi-Fi hotspots, perhaps using more personal devices, bring your own devices in the corporate environment. And I know my own company is embracing a lot of this stuff, but employees tend to find it a little bit of an ugly way to regard it, but we regard every one of our employees, every one of our staff members as a possible attack surface, to use that ugly expression. So suddenly having 4,000 people exposed to loose Wi-Fi networks and connected through personal devices, suddenly this exposes our corporate entity to many new types of attacks. So you can see some indications on the slide on screen, but we are tracking a significant increase. So you're seeing something like a 17% increase in measurable attacks on businesses just coming from COVID-related themes. You can see there 30,000% increase in COVID-related attacks on effectively individuals and corporates. But we're seeing as well that Google specifically, when it comes to its email tracking infrastructure, is stopping something like 18 million COVID-related phishing attacks or phishing opportunities every single day. So we're seeing a significant jump in opportunistic activity, people trying to take advantage of the new way that we're working in. And we're seeing, my own team is seeing something like a quadrupling in the amount of cyber activity that we've responded to, specifically since COVID started. So we're seeing dramatically new ways for the bad guys to evolve their own methodologies. And in fact, just a couple of moments ago, I saw that the large supermarket in the US called Target, the bad guys have only today created a new gateway that is saying that if you log into Target, you can get something like $170 worth of free shopping. And in fact, it's just a portal being used to spread malware. So they are evolving very rapidly, massively organized, really innovative, and finding new ways to attack the good people and the bad people, in fact. And so on this slide, I'm talking about the Maze ransomware group. Maze is one of those groups that we've seen on the rise through 2020. My colleagues were just talking about some of the things that we've seen in this space, and ransomware is a particularly prevalent type of activity. Causes a lot of damage, causes a lot of business refocusing as a result of suddenly losing all of your business operational continuity. You've lost access to your data, so how do you continue to do business today? And what have you lost? We are concerned that you've lost personal data, private data, Clients of mine have lost state secrets, so secrets about military designs, the designs of new airports. These are real case studies of clients of mine which are actively in the press. And so a lot of this stuff is coming from these organized criminals. And Maze is one specific example. Given the evolving threat landscape that we work in, we've seen that ransoms, so the number of ransomware attacks have gone up, but also the price of these ransoms has gone up. And it was, perhaps 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, even a few months ago, the traditional legal advice would be don't pay ransoms, very good reasons, possibly very legal reasons not to pay a ransom. But in fact, for a corporate position, from a corporate perspective, if the ransom was low and the pain was high, maybe you would consider paying a ransom. We've actually seen that the price of these ransoms has gone up quite dramatically, almost geometrically. So I have relatively small clients suddenly being demanded to pay £500,000. Now, the person has told me if it was £10,000, if it was £50,000, they would probably pay the ransom and try and get back to business as usual. But suddenly a £500,000 request is just far, far too dramatic. And what have the bad guys got to lose? So Maze is an interesting group because they run this a kind of losers league table, and their methodology is that they will steal your data, and they will steal your data. And so we've seen an increase in successful attacks and not merely potential or suspected attacks. So they will get access to your data, they will steal your data, and they will prove that they've stolen your data to you personally in a private capacity. And then they'll threaten you. So they'll create the time pressure and say, pay this ransom or your data will be published. And then they will publish your data. So if you don't pay the ransom, they have this league table of individuals, organizations that they've stolen data from with examples of the data that they've actually stolen. So a very credible threat. And this builds up in my mind to the time pressure of a crisis. So really building up this pressure about what does the organization do? Should they bite the bullet and react? Or do they have the opportunity and time to prevent, work with computer forensics teams like mine, work with external counsel like Paul and Taylor Wessing. And amusingly, this slide is entitled "Think of the Children." One of the ransomware organizations we were negotiating with on behalf of our clients said, well, look, you should really pay the ransom because actually this money is going to go and support children's charities in Poland. Which we weren't sure if it was actually a true indication, but it did really occupy our mind. The bad guys will find any opportunity to take your money off you. So we're operating in the new normal. The world has changed and we're seeing new attack mechanisms, new ways of the good guys and the bad guys working. And although we've seen the ICO and perhaps international regulators communicate what some organizations are regarding as a compliance pause, so effectively a relaxation of some of their compliance protocols, actually, we don't think it's really going to have a significant operational impact. Cyber attacks are still ongoing, the data is still being stolen, and the severity and the impacts of these breaches is only going up. And so, although I'm not giving legal advice, you will see at the bottom bullet point there that trying to get sympathy from a regulator by saying we're operating in unusual times, our IT staff are stretched and we're working in different circumstances. Actually, the business imperative to get back to business as usual is high. And we expect that there will be less sympathy from the regulator to say that because of exceptional circumstances, this data breach happened and we lost data and we lost customer trust. So in fact, again, the GDPR accountability principle, this is about accountability. And as an organization, you have accountability to put in place appropriate technical and organizational measures to make sure this happens. And we expect the regulators not to give you too much sympathy for too long. And so, again, the circumstances are changing. We can see that we're working in different ways and the threats are evolving in different ways as well. And again, even news that just came out today is that organizations have identified quite a number of cyber threats in these contact tracing applications that are being deployed by some of the nation states. So threats are changing, and perhaps this is just the new reality. This is just what we all have to live with. Well, is it, and should it be? One of the major problems that my team and no doubt Taylor Wessing's and US businesses as well will suffer from is a lot of the expectation that this just won't happen to us. We won't be the business that suffers the cyber attack. We won't be the next British Airways. We won't be the next Marriott. We won't be the next Cambridge Analytica Facebook $1 billion fine. But actually, in our experience, it happens, and it happens far more regularly than the majority of our clients ever expect. And so this is when I start to think about one of the sociological concerns I have. The majority of my clients didn't ever expect to be the victim of a cyber attack. They didn't expect that this was going to be a problem that they would suffer from. And so on this particular slide, I think that there is a specific synergy, effectively a correlation with the stages that my clients often go through and the Kubler-Ross model of the stages of grief. And, of course, it's a little bit trite, but the stages of grief, thinking about a significant problem, a major incident, can this be aligned to a cyber attack? Well, actually, I think it is, because very commonly the circumstances that we all see an organization go through are the phases of effectively grief. Denial. This didn't happen to us. We're confident that we don't hold the credit card information. We're absolutely confident that we encrypt our data. We're absolutely confident that our firewall works. And yet, those stages of denial very quickly turn to realization. Anger because you didn't spend enough money on your infrastructure. Depression because you realize that you now have this major problem. Social media is starting to talk about your problems, and so you're starting to bargain. If we say this, what will be the impact of that? And then that slow acceptance that this is your reality, and what are you going to do about it? So the Kubler-Ross model, I think, is quite closely aligned to what we as the cyber nerds call the NIST response model. So the National Institute of Science and Technology just creates this model which talks about cyber incidents and talks about the phases of preparation, then going through detection and analysis, containing the problem once you detect that you've suffered a problem, and then going into what our colleagues refer to as the lessons learned phase, the post-incident activity. And I think that these phases of effectively preparation, detection, containment, and lessons learned very closely aligned with that Kubler-Ross model. And on this particular slide, I've got the Kubler-Ross change curve, which again is effectively a different view and interpretation of effectively the grief model, but effectively the positive stages. So how you can go into creative alignment, new communications, new motivation, new capability creation. So effectively learning from your mistakes and growing above and beyond those. But effectively, how I try to contort this philosophy is that what you can see on this slide here is effectively the typical timeline that we experience going into a data breach. And commonly, most of our clients fail to realize that a data breach takes significantly longer to react and respond to than they ever expected to. They expect it to be over in days. They expect to have their systems operational again by the end of Monday, and yet it will take them 2 weeks, 3 weeks to actually get things working again. And in that time, you're writing to your customers and saying, we had a failure. You're responding to your regulators within 72 hours. You're spending weeks rebuilding your virtual machines. And this all takes time. And so, again, that Kubler-Ross model requires you to think about, are you reacting and responding to your crisis in a way that is really what your businesses expect and what your regulators will expect, and even your own senior executive management, are they doing what they should be doing? And so, again, on this particular slide, you can see from British Standard 11200, and it doesn't really matter what these legal standards say, but effectively, we try and draw a distinction between what is a crisis for a business and what should be just regarded as a typical operational weakness, but at the same time, your business shouldn't fall apart. And so I have a major concern about a crisis being something which is the phase of business operations when the business has started to lose control of itself and lose control of its ability to manage a problem. So all businesses are going to suffer cyber attacks, but not all cyber attacks should become a crisis. So you should very much have a control mechanism that allows you to manage this unexpected incident. This is, again, one of the other British standards. This is ISO 27035 on effectively crisis management. But this says that a cyber incident is an unexpected information security event. Not all unexpected incidents should mean that you fall apart and you don't know how to react, and suddenly your executive team start to crack under the pressure. And a lot of this particular presentation comes about because of work that I did on the British Airways cyber incident and many cyber incidents I've worked on. And I won't say that this happened in the British Airways incident, but CEOs, CFOs, the head of communications will literally start to break down into tears and say, I don't know what to do. My business is falling apart. I'm completely in a tatters. Help me get back into alignment. And so many of my team are ex-military, and there is a trite military expression that says, if you sweat more in training, you bleed less in battle. You absolutely should train your team for crisis management. And so there is a human-centric approach to dealing with a crisis, anticipating it, assessing it, preparing for it, communicating with it. And this is not just externally with your regulators, but your internal staff. What is your posture with your internal staff? What is your posture with social media, with the press, with your regulators, with your customers? And so it is absolutely possible to have a human-centric approach as opposed to merely a knee-jerk reaction to a data breach. And so you absolutely can train your team to think about the psychological stress that goes into dealing with a data breach. You know, your screaming CEO is absolutely the worst way to have your IT team fix your problems. And so if your CEO is screaming and screaming and saying, fix my problems, make sure that I'm back online within 5 hours, maybe that distracts them. Maybe it means that you don't get the best out of them. Having your team locked up dealing with a cyber crisis means that they are not dealing with business as usual. And so you have financial distractions. Your CFO is dealing with people like me and people like Taylor Wessing instead of dealing with the financial business. Maybe that's a good thing, and their focus should be on fixing the cyber incident. But having a way to create leadership around a crisis is absolutely essential to making sure that you can recover quickly and effectively. And so, again, commonly, and certainly what we saw at the British Airways infrastructure to their response was having this, what is commonly called a CERT, a cyber emergency response team. But having an effective response structure means that your response team, your crisis team can deal with the crisis, and other parts of the team can deal with other parts of the problem, which means that you can delegate upwards and downwards in an effective way. And you can create a command structure that can then delegate and deal with the right level of problem at the right time in the right way, which means that you then, rather than being knee-jerk reactive to the cyber problem, you're actively preemptive. You're preempting the concerns, and you're structuring yourself to delegate and deal with the right level of the crisis at the right time, which means that you're not caught off guard when the press starts asking you for interviews, and you're not constantly trying to find the right people to focus the right amount of attention on the right problems. And so give yourself the opportunity to make time. Give yourself the time to think about how you respond to the crisis. Give yourself a war room to focus your attention, and then practice. Practice, practice, practice. And there is that expression that those that can't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If you don't learn from your failures and your operational weaknesses, then you are only doomed to continue to make the same mistakes. So expect a cyber incident, but stop your incident becoming the crisis by preparation and effective delegation and management of your incidents. At that point, I'll finish and I'll hand it back to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Vijay. We do have some polling questions. I'm just slightly conscious of time, but I think if we just nip through the polling questions very quickly, and then we've got time for questions afterwards. So the first question is, how much do you think changes in working patterns as a result of COVID have impacted on your ability to respond to a serious data incident? And we've got 4 options there: much more difficult to respond, a bit more difficult to respond, no change at all, or, and I'll be curious as to if anybody says this, actually easier to respond to a data incident. So if you do have any thoughts on that, if you could put an answer in very quickly, that would be fantastic, because our system automatically collates them. I can only talk for so long before moving on to the next slide. And let's see what we have gotten results on that very quickly. Yeah, a bit more difficult to respond. That's pretty much what we expected. And Vijay, I'm assuming you're sort of seeing similar to that, with some much more difficult to respond as well.
Exactly. I think being stretched, not being in front of your computers, working from home, absolutely making it harder, and the bad guys are taking advantage of it.
On the next question, have you made changes to policies, processes, or technology relating to cybersecurity as a result of COVID? So this is coming back, and this is some of the answers, either significant changes, minor changes, or no changes. And this is coming back to some of the issues we were talking about at the start. So do your policies need revision? Do your agile working policies, are they sufficient for the entire workforce working from home? Are you having to scale up direct access VPN systems with multi-factor authentication to deal with all of that? And is that creating problems? Are staff trying to work around policies, and that creates other issues as well? So those are the kind of issues that we are thinking about there. And let's see where we've got to on the results of that. Okay, minor changes. Interesting that a quarter of you are saying no changes. Hopefully that's because businesses are in very good shape already, and for many businesses you'll have had a lot of people working from home in any event, so that won't have actually changed too much. But no surprises that we're seeing some with minor changes and a few there with significant changes as well. Third question, and it's third or fourth, so there's not too many. How confident are you that your business could continue operations to a significant degree if you were subject to a ransomware attack? And this is, picking up, could you easily restore from backups overnight without losing much data and carry on quickly, for example? So we've got very confident, fairly confident, and not confident. And some of you may well have gone through this of having had a ransomware attack yourselves, so actually have worked through this in real life. And therefore, I hope I'm not bringing back any painful memories on bringing operations online quickly on that. Oops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead by mistake there. Not confident, a third. Fairly confident, just over half. That's not really surprising, to be honest. Ransomware is constantly mutating, and it is a difficult issue to deal with. As we've seen over the last couple of years, the issues that Powell was talking about earlier, and major businesses like Norsk Aluminium being offline for a while, for example. So this is a real issue which is very difficult for businesses to actually deal with in practice. Picking up the last question, slightly sort of more hopefully flippant option at the end there. Has your business carried out a tabletop breach response exercise in the last 12 months? And we've just got yes, no, or what's a tabletop breach response exercise. Vijay, please go on mute if too many people answer what's a tabletop breach response exercise, because I can guess what you're probably saying. But this is just to get an idea of how people are, where people are placed on sort of carrying out these exercises as a key part of the preparation issues that Vijay was talking about earlier. So interesting, we've got equal on yes and no, and what's the tabletop breach response exercise. I mean, Vijay, I don't know whether you've sort of shifted since when we last spoke on this, but we are certainly, what we tend to see is that doing this at least every 12 months or so is a good idea, and perhaps even more often if you buy a business and are integrating new systems or something like that. I mean, Vijay, are you seeing a change in trend on that?
Absolutely. There are studies. So the major study in this space is called the Ponemon survey, and it finds that preparation, like a tabletop and breach exercise, is one of the most effective ways to reduce the cost and impact of a cyber attack. So really, really strongly recommended. Reach out to Ted Wessing and I, but we enjoy doing them. They're fantastically instructive.
Okay, and that is all that we had on polling questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in those. We've had some questions come through, and I'm trying to work out how to get them come up properly. So the first question is, have you found that organizations have the bandwidth to do security and exercises and training along with the business changes required due to COVID? That's a very good question. We've seen a couple of, we've seen sort of, and Vijay and Powell, I'll go to you in a second on this as well. We've seen sort of quite a bifurcated approach on this. Yes, some clients are struggling to having the bandwidth to do, to deal with these, as well as changes required because of shifts in working patterns and working requirements with COVID. Some businesses are, who are either more prepared or in fact did have a lot of work to do, were very keen to make sure that they identified any risks, additional risks that were created, and made sure that staff were aware of the issues. So did specifically dedicate additional resource to ensuring that new processes, new policies were embedded properly and that people were following them because they were acutely conscious of the risk. Vijay, Powell, I don't know whether you've seen any trends with clients on that.
I'll make a brief observation. Look, we've seen many organizations have to think again about how they budget for things in this year. Maintaining jobs is more important than perhaps buying a new firewall. But I think there is a realization that the bad guys are taking advantage of our stretched resources. And so, unfortunately, I don't think we can afford not to spend on this stuff. At the same time, we've seen transformations that would typically take 6 weeks happen in 6 months happen in a handful of weeks. So again, just be conscious of the risk of failing to invest in cybersecurity, especially given that there is a measurable uptick in this stuff.
I think this is one for you, Vijay. We've got a question. Is Zoom safe if one has standard antivirus and anti-malware software installed?
Yeah, I think Zoom has had a little bit of a poor press as a result of a concept called Zoom bombing. And there's some interesting GDPR implications to using some of these virtual conferencing systems. Zoom has done a lot of work to try to improve its cybersecurity. It's a bit like WhatsApp. It's saying it's having password protection and end-to-end encryption. There are alternatives, but at the same time, look, you're never obligated not to look at the security infrastructure that you're using when you're conducting your business practices. GDPR expects you to, and good data governance expects you to. Zoom is probably okay, but at the same time, you should have your own IT team conduct a thorough risk assessment of the way it's being used. Even as much as things like having open files behind you when you're video conferencing can potentially create a cyber risk. But Zoom is doing a lot to make sure it's fit for purpose in a modern age. We do have a threat intelligence briefing. Sorry, Paul. We do have a threat intelligence briefing, which I can distribute to anybody who wants to see it on Zoom.
Thank you, Vijay. We've had a request to provide a link to the Ponemon survey, Vijay, that you referred to. We'll make sure that gets sent to the person who requests that in the next day or so. Vin, I think you had a couple of questions come in as well.
That's right. There's a couple of questions that have come through, and normally we do try and call time on the session to stick to the hour, but that's generally because people are looking to get there. Certainly those in Europe are hoping to get their train home, but assuming everyone is actually at home at the moment, and still logged on, we'll just take that as read that you're permitted to just carry on for a few more minutes. So there's just a couple of questions I think worth focusing on. The first question I'm just going to pick up on here is about the hacking side of what we've been discussing today. The question is, are there any opportunities to trace the hackers back and take action against them? Maybe, Vijay, I'll just start with you, because I know you talked about some of those elements in terms of the forensic side, and perhaps talked a lot more to some of that experience that you have, and we've seen you in action on that too.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. There's a common misconception about catching the hackers and breaking their door down, with the FBI or the Secret Service or something. We can commonly, and invariably, we do find the bad guys. So we find who they are, the computers they came from, the countries they live in. But if you had a video conference, I'm shrugging my shoulders. Kind of so what? In the sense that actually, although the investigation element is important for your regulators, potentially important for your customers and your insurers potentially, knowing the identity of the bad guy doesn't really achieve much. It doesn't achieve much vindication. And so we can commonly trace the bad guys, and investigation is an important part of the NIST model, or effectively the reaction to a breach. But actually getting you back up to business as usual, thinking about the legal consequences, thinking about the practical consequences, reducing the business interruption time is perhaps our priority. So actually finding the bad guys tends to be a tertiary consideration, but we commonly can. I may refer to my legal colleagues about what we can actually do once we've been able to track those guys down, perhaps. I can make one observation. The police often doesn't care very much about the identity of the bad guys, but perhaps Paul and Paolo can talk to that.
Yeah, and agree completely with the point that it shouldn't be the primary consideration. And what we find with your external actor breaches, there's often somebody within senior management of the client who is very much, banging the table. I want to find out who did this. I want to go after them. And actually, that really isn't what you should be thinking about when dealing with the breach response itself. Taking action against them, I mean, there are some steps that you can take to sort of prevent publication of data, of stolen data and that kind of thing. It's obviously only effective within certain jurisdictions. We did a case a couple of years ago, which was the first case where anonymity was granted for a listed company against blackmail on a permanent basis, where blackmailers stolen data. PML against persons unknown is the reported judgment on that. Can you take action against them? There are certain things you can do. Should you be looking at hacking back, if that's what's sort of talked about by taking action against them? You run into very severe issues there around breach of the Computer Misuse Act yourself. Hacking back as a business is absolutely not recommended, but you can normally get reasonably good engagement with law enforcement if it's a serious incident, and work together with them with some sort of both civil and criminal remedies potentially. Obviously, if you find it's a group in Russia or somewhere like that, good luck, because you're not going to get any assistance with local courts against anybody domiciled in Russia.
Yeah, actually, from a German perspective, quite similar. The police is actually quite helpful, so they often have even specialized cybercrime units, and they have emergency hotlines. So they have, at least in a number of federal states here in Germany, they have people available around the clock, and they will assist in trying to hunt the attackers. And they actually, if you decide the ransom, they sometimes even assist in that regard in order to see whether the payment actually leads to some kind of clue about who the attacker is. But as Paul mentioned, very often those attackers won't sit in the same street as you, but they will be in some country where they cannot really be reached or prosecuted, even if you would actually find out who it is. So more often than not, respective trying to get reach of the respective hackers are in vain.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys, for that. Your last point, Paul, is very interesting, which links almost as if we'd planned it, almost but not quite, to the next question, which is businesses are increasingly coming under ransom pressure. Do you think they should pay? I know, Vijay, you talked about this on your presentation as well. Maybe you should kickstart.
Yeah, look, sorry, that's me, Ben, if that's all right. Look, the ransoms are happening, and I think it's important for the organization, if you have a business consideration about it, weigh up the business risk. There are certainly very good practical reasons not to pay a ransom. You show that you are the type of organization that can be ransomed. There's absolutely no guarantee you'll get your data back. Almost a certainty you won't get your data back with some other impairment like malware embedded in it, etc. But if it reduces your business interruption, maybe that's a commercial consideration. And if it is a commercial consideration, then it becomes, what is the pain versus benefit, in the sense that I would not recommend anybody pay £500,000 to get their data back, and even £50,000. But on the other hand, the cost of rebuilding your entire infrastructure, I've had clients that have written off £3 million worth of source code because they, from a policy perspective, weren't prepared to pay a £50,000 ransom. Now, there are business considerations there that I think may well have weighed in the other direction. But good reasons not to pay a ransom. And in my experience, typically paying the ransom does get you your data back, but it almost certainly comes with a few unexpected optional extras as well. Paolo, sorry.
Yeah, and just picking up sorry, go on, Paolo, you go first.
Yeah, no, I can only mirror what Vijay said. So at least from a German perspective, I mean, everyone generally does not recommend to pay the ransom, because obviously this is also an incentive for the attackers to keep doing what they do, because if they know they are paid, they won't stop. But certainly this is a business decision that has to be made, and depending on the pain that you're suffering, if there's business critical information or systems which you cannot use otherwise, you will have to think about the respective payment. And as I quickly mentioned before, very likely those payments would not be considered unlawful under German criminal law, because you're basically in an emergency situation if you really make those payments, but it's not crystal clear. So it may make sense to get the police on board and discuss it with them up front.
Yeah, the position similar in the UK on whether you can legally pay a ransom. It is still something of a grey area. There are potential criminal offences involved, but as a practical reality, there hasn't, as far as I'm aware, been a prosecution of anybody ever for paying a ransomware ransom in the UK. And if it's a business issue of any real size, you're probably talking with the police anyway. And we've certainly had issues with the clients where the police themselves have actually paid a small part of a ransom in Bitcoin because they want to undertake that exercise of following the process that the criminals then go through of splitting, recombining, sending the Bitcoin through hundreds, even thousands of wallets to try and hide it. So in practice, it does happen. Again, wouldn't recommend it, and there certainly are some grey area issues around legality which do need to be carefully considered if you are thinking about paying a ransom.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think given that we've allowed ourselves the comfort of just cracking on a little bit further than usual, I think it's time to perhaps draw it to a close there. So I would say thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also to our presentation team, Paul Glass, Voigt, and of course, Vijay Rathour. We hope you found it very useful today. And of course, please do take a moment and complete the questionnaire that will appear once the webinar closes. We really do value your feedback. Please also do look out for our ongoing program of events. Our forthcoming webinars, we will have another webinar in just a couple of weeks' time, planned for the 2nd of June, where we're going to look at the data issues with regards to the return to work scenario. What does that mean from a COVID-19 return to work, where employers are beginning to look at how do they deal with that from a workforce and the new normal perspective. So we'll be co-presenting that between our data team and our employment team on the 2nd June. Look out for that. More to come after as well. We'll start to look at some other key topics like the AADC, the Age Appropriate Design Code, which will have a huge impact on organizations where they are collecting data from children and how that will impact on those websites, those digital services, content and products. We really hope you can join us for those webinars. So from me, the team here, stay well and safe, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you all.
Thanks much.